what I'm trying to get across is that our nation has constantly taken a positive step forward on the question of racial justice and racial equality. But over and over again at the same time, it made certain backward steps.
We all say we want to get beyond racism. I propose a way to get beyond it. It may not be all that you want, but I haven't seen Eva or anybody else come up with a better way to do it. We'll be here until the year 2100 or later fighting over the data unless we take some steps to move in this direction of getting to that colorblind government that we say we all want.
Colorblindness is based on the notion that we must be blind to each other's colors in order to treat each other fairly. And in that sense, I think it is a very negative and cynical notion.
It's a step towards a colorblind society so that we don't deal with race as an issue. I mean, isn't that the goal of the so-called liberals? To have a colorblind society? Well, the way you get there is to stop referring to people and separating people by color.
The government should recognize race at all. I mean, one of Ward's favorite quotes is one of John F. Kennedy's, which he said that race has no place in American life or law.
The racial classification system that the government currently uses was born in the 17th century by slave owners in order to categorize and keep track of their property. The system of racial classification was nurtured by Jim Crow segregation in the South. The government again misused these categories during World War II by interning Americans of Japanese descent. The entire system is invidious from the start. There are some places where they offer 5 boxes to check, some places where there's 14 boxes to check, some places where there's 26. Sometimes you can only check 1. Sometimes you can check multiple boxes, as the census, multiple boxes. So there's 63 different categories that the federal government recognizes. So eventually this system will collapse of its own weight. The argument that most people respond to is the issue of categorization and classification in and of itself. The phone calls, the emails, the people on the street, they resent having to check a box. They resent not fitting into a box.
So at some point we have to say, is discrimination the most important thing that we have to address, or is it the consequences that flow from dividing our people according to race and ethnicity? And if we ever want to become a, quote, colorblind society, we have to start someplace. And I think it begins with our government.
Proposition 54 is not intended to create a colorblind, idealistic society. Proposition 54 is a very measured step towards having the California state government begin to de-emphasize race.
The only way many of us in this audience can be colorblind is if we put bags over our heads. Correct. I mean, the notion of colorblindness is ludicrous.
don't care about how our neighbor is doing or those who live, on the other side of the tracks, if we don't bother to collect data to determine whether or not they may be suffering from diseases at a different rate or whether certain groups may or may not have access to education, if we don't bother to investigate those kinds of problems or care about people of different groups or different races, our own individual success will inevitably be threatened.
With this initiative being put forward, it does enable us to at least put forward a positive platform saying, we actually need the statistics. We actually need to be in a state where we're not pretending to be colorblind, where we understand the inequities that are available to us and what's going on throughout the state.
30% of blacks and Latinos in the Orange County and LA counties have been the victims of housing discrimination just based on how they are perceived. Until people do not make judgments based on race, we need to have the tools to eliminate racism and discrimination.
But I think sometimes just common sense appeals to people. And if people can look at this in a common sense fashion, this isn't about classifying yourself as a certain color. This is about taking away information that creates equality in our society.
But we must see that the struggle today is much more difficult. It's more difficult today because we are struggling now for genuine equality. And it's much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to guarantee a livable income and a good, solid job.
For the longest time, our society, feeling guilty about the whole system of slavery, has bent over backwards trying to compensate the victims thereof. And now we are 4, 5, 6 generations past the Civil War, and we're still doing it, and in a very clumsy fashion. Because the problem is not race. It's not an issue. The problem is that people come from backgrounds where they didn't have adequate food. They didn't have the nutrition. They didn't have a household that was conducive to learning and to growing. It's about not race, but violence and brutality. And when you insert the issue of race, as we have in so many issues, we're diverted, we're distracted from the basic core problems of children not being reared in a healthy environment.
It really doesn't make sense to us, because as long as you continue to focus on race and continue to obsess about it, there's not going to be some revelation moment where you get beyond it. You're just going to continue to go down that path. If we're really going to be less conscious of race, we have to actively stop looking at it.
If not now, when? I mean, is it going to be 25 years, like we have the Supreme Court saying, well, in 25 years this is no longer going to be relevant? How do you put a timeline on that? We must begin. We must begin to act the way we want us to be.